Listen, you know The Simpsons. Even if you didn't watch it growing up, you have an idea of the characters and how they interact. That's just how popular they are. However, when it comes to games, only a few get mentioned in conversation. And as a licensed game connoisseur, if that's what you want to call me, this gets under my skin, since there's at least 20 different games based on the franchise, and I'm gonna play on the modern 3D ones because I have nothing better to do. Just no handhelds or 2D games, I have an idea for those. We're starting off the video with the one that everybody forgets about unless you're a gaming YouTuber, and I can't really blame you. Simpsons Wrestling is a PlayStation 1 exclusive that was released in the year 2001, a time when the PS2 was already released. This wasn't done because the publisher Activision had a deal with Sony, but because the console had the largest install base at the time, and porting it to other consoles meant spending more money, which is a no-no. By this time, The Simpsons already had a laundry list of 14 2D games under their belt, but Wrestling would be their first soiree into this new 3D thing. This is a lie. Technically, Virtual Springfield is the first 3D Simpsons game, but I didn't know that fucking exists until like 2 days ago, so oopsie on me. And it was bad. At least it looks nice. It doesn't play terribly, but by no means is it good. The whole thing feels like I'm using a Mad Catz controller that was covered in syrup and other miscellaneous fluids. But it still manages to be functional, at least. I was able to sit through an hour or so worth of fights, so there is that. The animations and movesets are different from character to character, so the power-ups sure are there. The voice cast returns. I got nothing to work with here. Visually, the game looks fine, mostly since Fox mandated the developer, Big Ape Productions, add black outlines for everything, which is an understandable decision for the most part, except for the fact that it made the frame rate tank as a result, so good luck playing this on native hardware. The charm of both the graphics and hearing the original voice cast wears off within 20 or so minutes. By then, you'll realize how chunky the game feels, how fast they make your opponents for some fucking reason, and just how unbalanced it all plays. Game offers no challenge whatsoever until Krusty, and he's basically impossible. That stuff aside, I also just personally don't think that the game really works with The Simpsons on a fundamental level. The concept really only works with Homer and Bart in my eyes, but with anyone else, it feels weird. It's just kind of off playing as Marge and partaking in domestic violence.
I've lost all my patience with you.
Counseling? I'll give you some freaking marriage counseling.
What the fuck is this? The whole point of their characters is a subversion of the I hate my wife style of humor that's still way too prevalent. What makes Homer and Marge so endearing is that the two of them love each other. They're not secretly waiting to kill each other in their sleep. This feels like bad fan fiction written by a kid with divorced parents and ready access to a firearm. Anyway, for some reason none of us can put our finger on, Simpsons Wrestling didn't do so well critically. It's a bit of a shame we didn't get to see another game from the property on the PlayStation 1, since this low poly style lends really well to the art style of Matt Groening. Eventually, Big Ape Productions would move on from The Simpsons and make another licensed game.
What? It's just an ordinary Krabby. Oh my goodness!
This all sort of makes sense when you realize that The Simpsons Wrestling was never really meant to be a Simpsons game in the first place. Instead, it was going to be a celebrity wrestling game, one that doesn't contain any wrestling. Apparently, developing Simpsons Wrestling was pretty rough, with a producer even quitting halfway through, as well as constant miscommunication and micromanagement, which would explain the end result. If you'd like to learn more, then I'd highly suggest that you watch Matt McMuscle's video on the subject, as well as read developer Michael Ebert's blog on the topic, both of which I used as sources and will be linked in the description below. In the March 2001 issue of the official PlayStation magazine, the preview for the game says, "Hopefully we'll be able to let you know if this is anything to have a cow about next month." That was Bart's catchphrase for a little bit. I still don't entirely understand why it was hip, but okay. Only for the game to be completely omitted from the next month's issue altogether, save for the solicitations at the back of the book. A magazine made with the sole purpose purpose to sell new PlayStation games, completely ignores a PlayStation exclusive game based on one of the most popular television shows to ever exist. How is it possible to fuck up that bad? Simpsons Wrestling is what you get when you make a licensed game, not because you have a great foundation for an adaptation, but just because you can. From what I've learned about development, there's no lack of passion at Big Ape whatsoever for the property, but more so cluelessness on Fox's part. Had the dev team been given space to make the game they wanted to without all the strict deadlines, this might have been a fun niche title to return to. I do wish that they were given a second shot at making a Simpsons fighting game, maybe one more akin to Soul Calibur, but as is, it's Simpsons Wrestling alright. This is the one. You thought wrestling was rough? You ain't seen shit yet. While not the first in the genre, the 2000s was bent over and dominated by Tony Hawk's Pro Skater and all of its contemporaries trying to make what ended up being pale imitations for the most part. And Fox must have really wanted a piece of the pie. Released in 2002 for the PlayStation 2 and developed by the Code Monkeys, not to be confused with the television show, Simpsons Skateboarding is one of the worst games I have ever played. No hyperbole, no exaggeration, no YouTuber bullshit, just pure hatred. The only other game that I've heard about that was also developed by the Code Monkeys is that one Garfield game that would release 2 years later. And if that doesn't set the tone, I don't know what does. Visually, this all looks like some sort of April Fool's joke MTV would make for their video mod series if MTV had a sense of humor. And this fucking intro trying so hard to be sick and tubular and bitchin' really isn't helping at all. Rarely am I ever a graphics snob, but outside of the world, which looks fine, the 3D models here are fucking ugly. Homer's head looks like it was decapitated and reattached with staples, Marge looks like she got a little too experimental with a set of clippers, and they all have dead eyes. This is The Simpsons, this isn't some fucking Nickelodeon show that'll be cancelled in 2 years, what the fuck? And surprisingly, the gameplay isn't much better at all. Thematically, skateboarding makes a lot more sense as a licensed game for the series considering it's Bart's whole personality, but the execution is just as bad as everyone says it is. Collision detection is completely broken, grinding doesn't work properly, your ollie is far too low to the ground, the control scheme is weird as shit, and there's not even many tricks to do in the first place. This all feels like an early prototype of the first 3D skateboarding game ever made. As you'll come to learn throughout this video, every 3D Simpsons game is just an emulation of a pre-existing formula, and by George, is the sports duology the fucking worst of the worst. Usually there's more to say, but skateboarding isn't bad in a fun way, but in an infuriating one. It is the quintessential example of shovelware. This shit makes the B-movie game look like it'd win a game award. I heard that the Garfield game isn't as bad as everyone says so maybe skateboarding suffered similar issues that wrestling did with lots of overhead and strict deadlines from Fox, but regardless, I could barely stomach more than 30 minutes of this shit. Pro Skater, this is not. Ironically, some of the developers at Big Ape who made wrestling would go on to work at Toys for Bob once Big Ape shut down, and that studio would go on to develop Disney's Extreme Skate Adventure, which despite the shitty name, is surprisingly good. I might just end up playing that to wash the taste of this out of my mouth. Yeah, now we're talking. Released in 2001, a year before skateboarding, Road Rage is a thinly veiled copy of Crazy Taxi, a game that I have a very strong fondness for. You might think that means that I'm against The Simpsons trying to recreate it, especially when taking into account their spotty track record. And no. I'm actually really fine with it. If Jet Set Radio and Super Monkey Ball can get games taking inspiration from them, what's so different here? Sega must not agree with me, since they ended up suing both the publishers and the developer, Radical Entertainment, for patent infringement, since technically they legally had the right to be the only ones to make games like Crazy Taxi. Personally, that's a giant crock of bullshit. The benefits of innovation and iteration come from imitation, and Road Rage was even able to improve on the formula in some small ways only important to those who have played the original before. It's especially upsetting since after only a couple more games, including one on the Xbox that would release 1 year after Road Rage, which could possibly be a reason for the lawsuit, the Crazy Taxi series as a whole would just go on ice after 2007. So there's nothing to fight for here. For those who've somehow never played Crazy Taxi, it's an arcade game where you get a timer and try to pick up as many customers as you can in the time allotted. The faster you get them there, the more money and time you get. The only difference in Road Rage is the story about Burns ruining Springfield with his nuclear buses, which gets the citizens of Springfield to become Uber drivers in protest, as well as unlockables like cars containing other characters like Krusty, and even some that get less time to shine in games like Willie and even Reverend Lovejoy, as well as unlockable maps, all of which adapt different parts of the town that contain different landmarks from the series. The unlockables gives the player a tangible reason to return to the game now and then, and small things like the optional minimap makes the game a lot less frustrating than Crazy Taxi can sometimes be.
I'm going to sleep with your wife!
I will say that the control scheme for Road Rage is a lot more natural, only using A to drive and B to reverse on Xbox, while Crazy Taxi is one of the few games that has a gear shift much closer to a real car. So to reverse, you had to press the gear shift button and then still press accelerate, and then gear shift back to drive forward. In an arcade cabinet, this probably felt pretty intuitive and really creative for the time, but it doesn't really translate well to home consoles. Road Rage speeds might be slower, but with a different control scheme, it's a slight improvement over Crazy Taxi. Only all that stuff is sort of thrown out of the fucking window since the collision detection is very rough. During my time playing the game on both the PS2 and Xbox releases, I often got caught on random parts of the road or invisible parts of buildings. Occasionally, a passenger will request that you don't hit traffic in order to receive a bonus, which is a little ridiculous for a game like this. You're supposed to be going fast. The hitbox is extremely sensitive. Stuff like that can be annoying, especially when the original game gives rewards for avoiding traffic or even making big jumps here and there, but in Road Rage, not only is it not rewarded, but your car comes to a complete stop way more often when hitting something. So at times it feels like 2 steps forward, but also 2 steps back. Visually, each unlockable map is very distinct from one another. While still not quite hitting the mark, Road Rage manages to grasp that Simpsons look and is somewhat impressive for locations that are meant to zip past you. And all this was done a year before skateboarding. Again, what the fuck is that game? And I appreciate that the later levels offer a much more difficult challenge in terms of terrain and speed, but with higher rewards, managing to keep a very repetitive formula somewhat interesting. There's both missions as well as a Sunday drive mode that allows you to take a nice stroll around the city, both of which are fine enough, but you're mainly just doing the same thing from beginning to end, going 50 over the speed limit from beginning to end. That's the real appeal of a game like this. Titles like Road Rage, Crazy Taxi, or fucking Cannon Strike are not meant to be completed in a day or so, at least in my eyes. They're meant to capture that arcade cabinet experience at home and always be there for when you feel like getting a hit of it, but don't feel like leaving the house. Or for people like me who never had a local arcade, it's meant to fulfill that itch that was never able to be scratched. Is there anything that wildly differs Road Rage from Crazy Taxi? No. But if that series can get away with copying itself, then this should get a pass as well. I can imagine this being pretty frustrating after spending a whopping $50 and getting a carbon copy of a game where you can experience most of its worth for a quarter or two. But in 2024, now that Road Rage is dirt cheap, it's just an already fun game with the Simpsons coat of paint, and enough stuff to make it worth revisiting once in a while when you want to relax a bit. Although if you do decide to pass it up, you're not really missing that much.
The Simpsons will be right back on Fox.
ボトルクーラープレゼント山に海にこの夏 CC レモンと CC グレープで冷たさ長持ちシンプソンズボトルクーラーが当たります欲しい CC レモン
LOL Sunday continues with a new The Simpsons.
I don't think I need to tell you that this game is the entire reason this video even exists in the first place. I've talked at length about lots of licensed games I played growing up, like TMNT, as well as various Disney and DreamWorks games, but none of them matched the amount of time and energy that I put into The Simpsons Hit and Run, yet another game named after a vehicular crime. Since I was raised in a religious household, I wasn't really allowed to watch anything that was deemed too adult, so obviously stuff like South Park, Family Guy, American Dad, but then even extended to The Simpsons. I think that was mostly due to the humor surrounding Flanders, which, to be fair, are some of the most softball jokes that you can make surrounding religion. So for the longest time, everything that I knew about The Simpsons came from this game, which isn't very much at all. Like the previous titles, Hit and Run is a clear copycat of another popular series, this case being Grand Theft Auto, another franchise I wasn't allowed to play, but still found ways to sneak a mission or two. As such, it's an open world game that focuses on exploration and a very large story, one that's kind of grand scale for a licensed game like this. Between the decent 3D modeling for 2003, the amazing soundtrack by Jeff Tinoshuk and Mark Barrel, as well as the return of the original voice cast, not just giving one-liners this time, but actually being able to record full conversations between fan favorites, Hit and Run immediately feels like a special episode of the TV series by capturing not only the visuals but the writing of the series, more than any other game that I've mentioned so far. While the scale is big, the moment-to-moment plot is very simple. There's a new soda being released named Buzz Cola that was actually hinted at in Road Rage with billboards in it, so that's pretty neat. The new drink eventually gets tied into this conspiracy with black vans and Bart being abducted. A major tonal shift, but of course it's revealed that Kang and Kodos are behind it, and are using the cola to mind control Springfield and the WASP cameras around the town to spy on them solely for their reality TV show titled Foolish Earthlings, which has been slowly falling in ratings. One by one, the entire Simpson family and Apu, for some reason, all pieced this together and decided to destroy the spaceship using radioactive waste on top of canonically sacrificing both Snake and Grandpa. I shit you not. The main thing that keeps you going through the game is the writing. Most of the time, the conspiracy takes a backseat to random side quests for other characters in Springfield, mainly Professor Frink and Snake. I don't know why those two are the dev team's favorites, but it's the character interactions that constantly got chuckles out of me. It's easy to give games like Hit and Run a pass as long as you're a fan of the source material. But as I'm going to point out in a second, this game is not perfect whatsoever, and arguably way worse than many of us remember. However, it is worth commending on how the team at Radical Entertainment were able to capture what makes The Simpsons so memorable without feeling like a cash grab. There's 7 levels, each of which has their own playable character, although Homer and Bart get 2 levels for some reason. You'd think Marge would get 2 for discovering the conspiracy in the first place, or Lisa would get 2 for saving Bart, but whatever. Each of these levels takes place in a different area of Springfield, residential, downtown, and near the beach. But from level 4 on, these areas are repurposed for the second half of the game, all of which vary wildly in terms of quality. Marge's is one of the best in the game, while both Bart's second level and Apu's were where the game really chugged for me. Hit and Run is set in late October, and the final level is fittingly a treehouse of horror style with Springfield covered in Halloween decorations on top of being full of zombies. The dev team went all out. The cars are different, the layout of the map has been changed, mostly to make it smaller. There's dead trees, graffiti everywhere, zombies roaming around. Even Flanders' home is boarded up with signs in the front lawn saying that it's the end times. It's kind of surprising how much attention went into it when there's little to nothing to do in the open world. Technically, this game is a sandbox, but there's not too much to explore or play with at all. You can collect 49 cards that are spread throughout the game or compete in races, and there's even one bonus mission per stage, but the majority of Hit and Run is just spent driving, be it racing, destroying other cars, or delivering stuff. There is the occasional on-foot mission, and I sort of wish that there were more of these akin to the Cola Caper with Marge. I don't know why that mission is so fun to me. I don't know, as beautiful as the world is, rarely did I ever end up walking around it. Although the platforming is very finicky and requires you to be so precise that it becomes annoying. And the clunky camera didn't help whatsoever. Especially in missions like Never Trust a Snake, where as Apu you have a limited amount of time to collect trash cans. Some have to be retrieved in a car and others have to be retrieved on foot, as well as have time left over to get back to the DMV. If you can't tell, I fucking hate that mission. Yeah, that's the thing. The opening hours of Hit and Run are the most memorable, and they're so fun and easygoing until you get bitch slapped by some of the most frustrating missions I've ever played. Vox Nerduli has to be one of the most hair-pulling, mind-boiling, fingernail-pulling, eye-gouging missions I have ever had the disservice of fucking playing, and the same goes for its sequel, Nerd Race Queen. Bonfire of the Manatees is similarly frustrating since it's hit the truck 15 times, has a time limit that gets me just close enough to completing the objective before it completely fucking runs out, which is more frustrating than just sucking altogether. Slithery sleuthing, Alien Autopsy 1 through 3. It's not just one mission I can pin the blame on. Out of the 49 story missions you have to do, about 15 of them are completely insufferable. That is 30% of the game. The problem is that Hit and Run has to know that these missions suck the piss out of my sheets, because it is still, to this day, the only game I have ever encountered that allows you to skip a fucking mission entirely if you're struggling. The only ones that you can't skip are the final 3, which is probably why I was never able to complete the game as a kid. The farther the game goes on, the more these infuriating missions begin to sprout out of the ground, since they get longer with shorter time limits and begin to combine objectives. By the end, you come across the 3 Alien Autopsy missions, where in each and every one of them, you have to go to the power plant in a tight time limit, escape an alien car, get the nuclear waste, avoid another alien car as well as the cops, since you'll more than likely get a hit and run trying to get there fast enough, and get to the school playground in a short amount of time. If you drop the nuclear waste, then you have to go back to the plant and try it again. And if you fail any of these steps, you have to go all the way back to the beginning of the mission. There are no checkpoints in Hit and Run. That is the upsetting nature of playing this as a game, completely removed from nostalgia. Most of the missions offer a fair challenge, and are managed to be fun, save for the ones that solely get on my fucking nerves. Having finally completed it as an adult, I feel like it was worth the perseverance, but only as a sort of retribution for my childhood self. I still enjoyed my time, even if the game ended up being a little bit long by the end. Having actively watched The Simpsons as an adult, and finally being able to understand some of the references from the collectible cards, and pick up on the character interactions, made for a much more fulfilling experience. I'll always maintain that the opening 3 levels are some of the most perfect video gaminess to ever be put on a disc, and Lisa's level will always be cemented into my mind solely due to the beautiful sunset and amazing jazzy backing tracks. The soundtrack is just as catchy as it's always been. It's so fucking good. It's kind of insane in 2024 that Hit and Run is still regarded as the best Simpsons game, but after playing all these, I still can't argue with that sentiment. Looking at it 21 years later, of course Hit and Run will feel like a janky mess. The way we remembered it is not quite the way it is. And if we're being honest, I spent a little more than I felt comfortably doing so, but I rationalized it in my screwy brain as a grail purchase since my childhood copy broke a long time ago, and there's still a certain charm with owning a game and playing it completely separated from the internet or any other distractions on my computer. The day or 2 I spent just playing this cooped up in my bed were some of my favorites when it comes to making videos. You know, except for the hair pull. Apparently there could have been a PSP port, which would have been great for an upcoming PSP video, but alas it was cancelled because we can never have good things. Portable Hit and Run is just too good for this world. Obviously this game was a huge success. It honestly should have been the beginning of a new era of Simpsons games with Radical Entertainment at the helm, ones inching closer and closer to the good games category instead of just good licensed games. The devs even began working on a sequel. So, what happened? Well, the publisher for both Road Rage and Hit and Run, Vivendi, turned down a contract to make 5 more Simpsons games, which sort of ended up shooting the entire game franchise in the foot. As without Vivendi, Radical couldn't continue making Hit and Run 2 and shelved the sequel. With their main moneymaker out of the picture, no more titles would be released for a few more years as a result. But you can't really blame Vivendi. After all, it was the 2000s. Licensed games were everywhere, flooding shelves like a venereal disease. Many other publishers had made similar deals and would basically become licensed game factories as a result, like Activision and Beanox with Spider-Man or EA with Star Wars in the mid-2010s. So what did Vivendi go on to do? They were acquired by Activision and would go on to publish licensed games in between the occasional Spyro title until their dissolution just 5 years later. Oh. Look, I'm not saying that the Simpsons deal would have saved them or anything, but this seems a lot better than the alternative here. Despite fan outcry for a remake, beyond the soundtrack becoming readily available online recently, Hit and Run has been delegated as a cult classic for those who are alive in that era, or for those who are stupid enough with money to spend ridiculous amounts of it experiencing it in the modern day. And unfortunately, like many other great licensed games, it will definitely stay that way forever. Also, why the fuck is the soundtrack $70 on iTunes? If Road Rage is underrated and wrestling is forgotten, the Simpsons game has been damn near wiped from our collective memory. Released in 2007, Enhance.
Oh my goodness! Squid!
Yeah, I failed to mention that EA had the rights for a little bit in the early 2000s before Vivendi would take over for a little bit, but we all know how that ended. After Hit and Run success, EA would return to buy the exclusive rights to publish Simpsons games, meaning that they'd be the only studio to publish Simpsons titles for the foreseeable future. Coincidentally, this is also the last Simpsons game to ever be released on console. Oh god. It was released in 2007, just months after the Simpsons movie, which my father paradoxically rented for us to watch. Look, I love my family, but consistency and religious parents do not exist in the same space. This was the game I knew the least about going into this video. I'd always sort of figured that it was made to coincide with the release of the movie, and while that probably played a role in its release date, the Simpsons game was actually in development since at least 2004, with a build made on the original Xbox, which was made popular by these edits of Bart after a lobotomy. Don't expect me to explain internet humor to you, okay? So why title it The Simpsons Game after 20 titles preceding it? Well, according to a writer for both the game and the series, Matt Selman, the title The Simpsons Game, although not particularly hilarious I admit, is sort of meant to signify that we're restarting the Simpsons gaming franchise. This is a big, new, fresh game that takes on video games and hilarious things of all time. That's why we didn't feel the need, as of yet, for a hilarious subtitle like Extreme Action or In the Mix, end quote. Yep, it was a new beginning indeed. Well, how do you evolve from copying a game for each installment? Simple. You copy every game in one installment. The entire premise of the Simpsons game is that the family finds the game manual, which gives them video game powers. For the most part, it plays like a 3D platformer, but there's some Pikmin in there, as well as random recreations of classic games. The entire thing is built upon the premise of self-referential and self-aware humor. It's kind of hard to play this and not feel like it's somewhat a criticism to previous titles being so derivative, which feels a little weird, but the worst part is that it's very hit or miss. Only some of the jokes land. Pot shots at EA feel in line with the property since they've made jokes about Fox before. The level where Marge is against a violent video game titled Grand Theft Scratchy, which is fucking hilarious, and so she tries to get it banned by starting a riot and fighting the cops. It's so good. But there's one that's especially egregious, and it's the video game cliches where a comic book guy will pop up and make fun of switches and levers or time limits or whatever. But like, it feels ugh. Like, commenting on it doesn't mean that you're not guilty of the same crime. And if anything, pointing it out like it's some joke makes you sound obnoxious. Episode 5 is where it gets really rough. Yeah, levels are called episodes here. Where Professor Frank is kidnapped by not Donkey Kong, and you go through a not retro game, fighting not retro characters from Madden and Street Fighter, complete with references like, all your base are belong to us. This was 2007. This is like if you took the angry video game nerd and sucked out all of James Rolfe's passion and amateur filmmaking, and what you're left with is old jokes regurgitated onto your fucking screen. Oh look guys, it's Sonic and Mario in Running Wheels. It's Sonic. It's, get it, because it's like they're forcing him to make more games. Because he's running on a hamster wheel, so there's constantly games coming out. It's funny, right? But it's funny, like, come on, like look at it. A reference or allusion to an old property here and there is completely fine, and sort of expected with a comedy franchise like this. But the more that your game solely relies on it, and humor that whittles down to, yup, we're in a video game, the more it feels closer to something like Family Guy. And I don't like Family Guy. It even extends to other parts of the game that you wouldn't think of. Something I haven't even mentioned in this video is how good looking all the cover art and promos are. Rarely is a licensed game given exclusive art this good looking. Save for skateboarding, all of this feels on brand while still making it very clear to the potential buyer what kind of game this is. But with the Simpsons game, it's just the character models against a yellow background. Like, yep, it's the Simpsons. In a game. You really don't know what's good until it's gone. The Simpsons game is one of those titles that's built with co-op in mind, which feels a lot like the LEGO games where you'll have to switch between two characters if you're playing solo. The only issue here is that the AI partner is almost completely brain dead, meaning that you constantly have to switch between the two to put one in place, and almost cross your fingers that they'll stay still until the puzzle is done. After trying to find a decent copy of this game that wasn't an arm and a leg, I ended up landing on the Wii release, which does lack some features like the open world, but apparently that's just barren, so whatever. The Wii actually uses the D-pad as a second stick, which credit where credit's due, that's a lot better than most titles that utilize the Wiimote and nunchuck. And the control scheme actually does a decent job, except for the fact that the camera itself is clunky as hell, something that cannot be blamed on the Wii since I also experienced it on the PS2 and PSP releases. This thing is just bad. It's constantly getting blocked by the terrain and even gets caught on it sometimes. Pressing Z is supposed to snap the camera back, and that only works if there's enough space for the camera to turn around. So the camera only ends up working 60% of the time, 100% of the time. The rest, it completely gets in the way of platforming, something you don't want for a 3D platformer. The combat only feels slightly better than Hit and Run, which is a game that wasn't focused on combat at all. It was only used if you wanted to hit the optional WASP cameras. That's not to excuse it, that game's kicks felt finicky and would only really work if you were right on target. Yet somehow, released 3 years later, the Simpsons game is no better. You kind of need to lock onto everything to hit it right, which is kind of bad news for a game that also wants to be a beat 'em up. Interestingly enough, the Wii has exclusive minigames like Bite Night the Champion, where you have to eat as much junk food as you can, and I ended up liking it a lot more than I thought I would. It almost makes me wish that there was a Simpsons WarioWare knockoff or something, so shout out to Rebellion Developments for adding that in there. But the best part of the game, hands down, is the 2D cutscenes that are completely on model. Gone are the days of fucked up Uncanny Valley pre-renders, except for when they come back for some reason. I don't know how these look worse than the actual game, but whatever. The voice cast returns again, which as much as I love their passion for this series, it doesn't feel like a selling point here anymore. Although they do a great job, and some of the lines are really funny. Except they repeat too often to the point where I prefer to play the game completely on silent. Even the soundtrack, which starts off strong in the beginning with the chocolate dream Homer's having, has this almost Alice in Wonderland sound, is really funny, but eventually it just sort of slides into the background. When I got halfway through episode 4 with its constant, never-ending, ceaseless references, and realized that there were at least 4 more hours worth of the game, I had to set it down. Or exit out of the emulator. I watched the later portions of the game online, and while it seems like some parts of the game get more out there, with an episode dedicated to fighting both Will Wright, the creator of The Sims, from destroying retro Simpsons games,
I'm Will Wright, bitch!
as well as series creator Matt Groening, along with characters from his other franchise, Futurama, and the game might be trying to say something, but it all gets lost in a sea of clunky controls and EA references. At a first glance, the Simpsons game feels like a step in the right direction for the franchise, as it's less trying to be a one-to-one recreation of a pre-existing game, and is instead somewhat original. I say that with an asterisk. The idea of a Simpsons game with an amalgamation of different playstyles sounds perfect for the property, and Marge's level is a perfect example of that. They even try to do similar things with Lisa having a sort of god game type, and Homer's, which is sort of a bowling ball Katamari thing, but the undercooked gameplay, the blatantly unfunny humor, and constant reliance on references to video games feels less like a loving tribute and more like member berries. And I have to agree with the criticism that, although the games preceding it were wildly varying in quality as you've seen firsthand, you at least knew what you were getting into when you bought something like Simpsons Skateboarding or Hit and Run. While the Simpsons game, paradoxically calling itself that as if it's the definitive game in the franchise, is such a messy hodgepodge of ideas and references and stiff gameplay that I'm not really sure who would like this at all. Look, as much as I don't like this game, I'd have liked to have seen a sequel that would have tried to be more out there and not play it safe with this sort of humor. One that could fix the issues this one had. However, the sequel was cancelled again, and that's the last Simpsons console game. Since buying the rights, EA hasn't really capitalized on the Simpsons IP in the way we thought they would, except for one thing. EA bought the license in 2005, before mobile games would become the big new thing. I've touched on it many times briefly in my many other videos on licensed games, but to retell it as short as possible, by the late 2000s and especially the early 2010s, as game development for consoles became more expensive, mobile games became the new shovelware dumping grounds, with the biggest benefit being spending little to no money at all and getting big returns. Unless your name was Spider-Man or the Ninja Turtles, full-on console games became the way of the dodo bird, and it eventually caught up to them too. Save for the LEGO games and the occasional outstander that was usually a shitty cash grab. Why is this relevant to our Simpsons video? Well, in 2012, just 5 years years after the release of the Simpsons game, EA released Simpsons Tap Out for iOS and Android. For those who don't subject themselves to shit like this, it's Sim City just with predatory microtransactions. But the main issue is that it earned over $130 million by 2014, which was 11 years ago, and the game has consistently been supported since. It almost feels like one big prank. The Simpsons' constant emulation of other game types, including parodying the publisher known for scummy business decisions, has all led to them becoming an EA mobile game with microtransactions so scummy that the show itself makes jokes about it. It'd be easy to think that this is the end of the story, but after all, time is one big circle. Not only is Crazy Taxi getting a new installment, but AA licensed games are making a return, specifically with games based on The Last Ronin, as well as a Mutant Mayhem game releasing this year that makes me want to leak bodily fluids in excitement. With The Simpsons returning for a 36th season sometime soon, as well as an entirely new line of toys with Jack Specific releasing later this year, I don't see a smaller scaled game being completely outside of Fox's purview. Like, I don't know, fucking Treehouse of horror game, or a fucking a 2D Rhythm Heaven game? That sounds fun. Will EA actually decide to make something original for once? Who knows? All I know is that it better have a crime-based subtitle or I don't fucking want it. Like, The Simpsons Child Neglect.
Chill out, homeboy.
Last time I checked, we are superheroes!
Dr. Wang, Jucano, El Jefe, Nonstop, and Pasto.
Yo, crackers!
Get out, boy!
Minority Team, fighting for all.